The fluorescent lights of the Value Mart hummed a tired, buzzing song, the only music Lena had known for the past 2 years. It was a sound that coated everything, from the sticky residue on the conveyor belt to the weariness in her own bones. Each beep of her scanner was a countdown, not to the end of her shift, but to the next bill she couldn't quite pay. She was 20, but some days she felt ancient, worn smooth by the constant friction between what she earned and what her grandmother needed. Outside, the rain had started, a thin, gray drizzle that promised a cold walk home. The line at her register was long, a chain of sullen faces and overflowing carts. It was in the middle of this monotonous rhythm, scanning a carton of milk, that the world tilted. A small, sharp cry cut through the store's drone. And then a heavy thud. Lena's head snapped up. Down by the produce section, a woman lay on the linoleum floor, a splash of spilled oranges rolling around her like fallen stars. She was old, elegant even in her collapse, dressed in a beautiful, embroidered abaya. A delicate hand was clutched to her head, her face pale with shock and pain. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Customers craned their necks, murmuring. A floor manager barked into his walkie-talkie about a cleanup on aisle 3, but no one moved toward her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She saw not just an old woman, but the ghost of her own grandmother's fragility, the terror of a fall that could change everything. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, was watching from his glass-walled office, his face a mask of pinched annoyance. Abandoning her post was the cardinal sin. It meant write-ups, docked pay, a step closer to the door. She knew the rules, but the woman on the floor wasn't a rule. She was a person, bleeding and afraid. The cost was clear, written in the cold set of Henderson's jaw. And in that moment, Lena decided she would pay it. She hit the small red button on her register that closed the lane, ignoring the symphony of groans from the customers behind her. "My lane is closed," she said, her voice small but firm, not looking at any of them. She moved with a purpose that felt foreign in her own body, her worn sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as she rushed toward the fallen woman. She knelt, the cold of the linoleum seeping through the thin fabric of her jeans. The woman's eyes were wide with a bewildered fear that Lena knew all too well. A thin trickle of blood matted the silver hair at her temple. "It's okay," Lena whispered, her voice instinctively dropping into the soft, soothing tone she used with her grandmother. "You're okay. My name is Lena. I'm here to help you." She gently took the woman's hand, its skin as soft and thin as parchment. The woman flinched, a low moan escaping her lips. Lena didn't ask questions. She didn't ask if she was all right. She knew she wasn't. Instead, she began to hum a low, tuneless melody her grandmother had taught her, a simple lullaby that was more breath than sound. It was an instinct, a piece of home she carried inside her. The woman's panicked breathing began to slow, her eyes focusing on Lena's face. From the corner of her eye, Lena saw a man standing motionless at the end of the aisle. He was tall, dressed in a crisp white thobe and a red and white keffiyeh, his face a study in still, silent observation. He watched not the scene, but her. He saw the way her hand rested on his mother's arm, the way her voice created a small pocket of calm in the chaos. Lena pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice clear and steady as she gave the details. And then, Henderson was there, his shadow falling over them both. "What do you think you're doing, young lady?" he snapped, his voice loud and accusatory. "You abandoned your register." With a full line. "She's hurt, Mr. Henderson," Lena said, not looking up. "I've called an ambulance. You're not a doctor. You're a cashier," he sneered. "Your job is to scan groceries. That's a violation of company policy 34B. Adherence to assigned station. Pack your things. You're done." The words landed like stones, but Lena barely felt them. All she could feel was the slight, trusting pressure of the old woman's hand in hers. The man in the thobe took a single, deliberate step forward, but the paramedics were already arriving, their presence eclipsing everything else. As they lifted the woman onto a stretcher, her eyes found Lena's one last time, a silent question in their depths. Lena just nodded, a promise she didn't know how to keep. Then she was gone. Henderson jabbed a finger toward the door. Now Lena stood up, her legs shaking, the humiliation a hot flush on her cheeks. She walked away from her register, from the only job she had, her manager's voice echoing behind her, a final, petty pronouncement of her failure. She didn't see the tall man in the white thobe turn from his mother's side to watch her go, his expression unreadable, his silence more powerful than any shout. The next morning, the world felt muffled, gray. The rain had returned, tapping a mournful rhythm against the single window of her small apartment. The termination slip from Valuemart lay on the kitchen table like a death certificate for the life she thought she had. How would she explain this to her grandmother? How would she afford her medication? The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Just as she was sinking into the familiar mire of panic, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. With a sigh, she answered. "Is this Lena?" a man's voice asked. It was deep, calm, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "Yes," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "My name is Khalid Al-Jamil. My mother was the woman at the grocery store yesterday." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. Is she okay? She will be. She has a concussion and needed a few stitches, but she is resting." There was a pause. "I would like to offer you a position. A car will be at your address in 1 hour." To discuss the details. Before she could process the words, before she could ask what he meant, he had hung up. An hour later, a sleek black car, so clean it seemed to absorb the gray light of the day, was waiting at her curb. The driver, a man in a simple black suit, opened the door for her without a word. The ride was silent, carrying her out of her world of cracked pavement and chain-link fences into a realm of manicured lawns and stone mansions that looked like they were carved from the clouds. The car stopped before a set of towering iron gates, which swung open silently, admitting them to a long, winding driveway. The house wasn't a house. It was an estate. It sat in a silence, so profound it felt alive. The driver led her to the front door, a massive slab of dark wood, and for the first time, Lena's courage faltered. This was a mistake. She didn't belong here. The door was opened by a woman in a severe gray dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I am Ms. Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice as crisp as starched linen. "I am Mr. Al-Jamil's head of staff and his mother's primary care manager." She looked Lena up and down, a flicker of disdain in her eyes. "You are the girl from the supermarket." It wasn't a question. It was a classification. Lena simply nodded, feeling her cheap jacket and worn jeans under the woman's scrutinizing gaze. "Follow me." Ms. Eleanor led her through a cavernous foyer of marble and dark wood, the only sound the click of her sensible heels. The air smelled of old books and something exotic, like roses and spice. They entered a vast, sun-drenched room where the old woman from the store, Layla, sat in a plush armchair, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. Khalid Al-Jamil stood by the window, the same man from the store, now dressed in a simple dark suit that somehow looked more commanding than his thobe. He turned, his eyes meeting Lena's. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice the same calm baritone from the phone. "My mother, Layla, has Alzheimer's. Her moments of clarity are intermittent. But yesterday, after she returned from the hospital, she asked for the girl with the quiet song." Ms. Eleanor's lips thinned into a razor line. "Mr. Al-Jamil believes your unorthodox methods might be of some comfort to his mother. Your role would be as a companion. The pay is substantial." The way she said unorthodox made it sound like an insult. The air was thick with her disapproval. Lena looked from Ms. Eleanor's cold stare to Khalid's steady gaze, and then to Layla, who was now looking at her, a glimmer of recognition in her clouded eyes. This world was intimidating, foreign, and she was an unwelcome intruder. But in Layla's face, she saw not an illness or a job, but a person. And that was a language she understood. Lena's days fell into a new, quiet rhythm, a world away from the frantic beeping of the Valuemart. The vast, Silent Mansion became her workplace, its hushed corridors and sunlit rooms a stark contrast to the life she knew. Her official title was companion, but her role was far simpler, to just be with Layla. At first, Ms. Eleanor shadowed her every move, a silent, disapproving presence. She would correct Lena's posture, critique her tone of voice, and leave color-coded schedules detailing Layla's enrichment activities, memory games Layla had no interest in, classical music that only seemed to agitate her. Mrs. Al-Jamil requires structure, Ms. Eleanor would state, her voice clipped. Your approach is sentimental. It lacks professional discipline, Lena never argued. She would simply nod, wait for Ms. Eleanor to leave the room, and then pull a chair close to Layla's. She didn't force conversation. She just sat, sometimes reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice low and even. Other times, she would simply hum that same little tune from the grocery store. It was on the third day that the breakthrough happened. Layla had been agitated all morning, pacing the room, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. Ms. Eleanor had tried to redirect her with flashcards, an exercise that only escalated Layla's distress. Finally, Ms. Eleanor retreated, muttering about needing to adjust medication schedules. Lena waited until she was gone, then sat at the grand piano in the corner of the room. She couldn't play, not really, but she knew a few simple chords her grandmother had taught her. She tentatively picked out a melody, the notes soft and hesitant in the big room. Layla stopped pacing. She turned, her eyes, usually lost in a fog of confusion, focusing on Lena with a startling clarity. That song, Layla whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. My father played that. She walked slowly toward the piano and placed a frail hand on Lena's shoulder. Your voice, she murmured, a faint smile gracing her lips. It makes the shadows quiet from the doorway, Khalid watched unseen. He had been there for several minutes, drawn by the sound of the piano. He saw the genuine peace on his mother's face, a peace that Ms. Eleanor's rigid professionalism and a team of expensive doctors had failed to provide. He saw the natural, unforced connection between the two women, one old and losing her world, the other young and trying to find her place in it. He saw not an employee and a patient, but two souls communicating in a language beyond words. But Ms. Eleanor saw something else entirely. She saw her authority being undermined. She saw years of training and methodology being upstaged by a girl with no qualifications other than a soft voice and a lullaby. Her resentment began to curdle into something colder, more dangerous. The bond between Lena and Layla was not a miracle to her. It was a threat. And it was a threat she was determined to neutralize. The small, silver locket was Layla's most cherished possession. It was worn smooth with age, a tiny, heart-shaped container that held miniature, faded portraits of her late husband and a baby Khalid. She touched it constantly, a nervous, comforting habit, her thumb tracing the worn engraving. When her mind was clouded, the locket was her anchor, a tangible piece of a life she could no longer fully grasp. One afternoon it was gone. The disappearance sent a ripple of distress through the household. Layla was inconsolable, her agitation escalating into a deep, sorrowful confusion. She wandered from room to room, her hands fluttering at her neck, murmuring her husband's name. Ms. Eleanor conducted a search with grim efficiency, her movements sharp and purposeful. She questioned the maids, the gardeners, the cook. Her questions were pointed, her gaze suspicious. Then, she requested a private meeting with Khalid. Lena waited in the library, her stomach a knot of anxiety. She could hear their muffled voices from Khalid's study down the hall. Layla had been in her care all morning. If the locket was missing, the blame would naturally fall on the newest, least trusted member of the household. She felt the invisible walls of the mansion closing in on her. She was an outsider, a charity case. The girl from the supermarket. Her worst fears, the ones that whispered she didn't belong, were about to be realized. The study door opened. Ms. Eleanor emerged, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. Khalid followed, his expression unreadable. Lena, he said, his voice quiet but heavy. Please come in. Lena walked into the oak-paneled room, feeling like a defendant entering a courtroom. Ms. Eleanor stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed. The locket disappeared this morning, Lena, Ms. Eleanor began, her tone clinical. It was on Mrs. Aljamil's neck when you began your time with her. Now it is gone. You were the only person with her. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. She wasn't just saying Lena was careless. She was implying she was a thief. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. I would never, she stammered, her voice trembling. I don't know where it is. Of course not, Ms. Eleanor said, a cruel hint of a smile on her lips. Things like that just vanish. Khalid remained silent, watching Lena, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw not guilt, but a deep, wounded panic. He saw the same girl who had knelt on a dirty supermarket floor, offering comfort without a thought for herself. The silence stretched, thick with judgment. Lena's internal narrative screamed at her. They see you for what you are. You don't belong. You're disposable, just like at the store. She looked at Khalid, expecting to see the disappointment, the dismissal. She was ready to be sent away, her brief, strange dream over. Her hands were cold, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a small, defensive gesture against a world that had always been too quick to cast her out. Khalid did not look at Ms. Eleanor. His gaze remained fixed on Lena, his expression calm and deliberate. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw an integrity that felt as solid and real as the ancient oak of his desk. He had spent his life evaluating people, reading their intentions in the subtle shifts of their eyes and the cadence of their speech. What he saw in Lena was not deceit. Ms. Vance, he said, his voice low and even, cutting through the tense silence. Where have you searched? Everywhere, Mr. Aljamil, she replied stiffly. Her suite, the sitting room, the gardens. It is not there. Not everywhere, Khalid said softly. He turned and walked out of the study, not waiting for a reply. Lena and Ms. Eleanor followed him, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. He led them back to the sunroom where his mother was now sleeping fitfully in her chair, exhausted from her distress. He didn't go to her jewelry box or her bedside table. Instead, he walked to a large, ornate ceramic pot that held a thriving fiddle-leaf figure. He reached deep into the soil, his fingers digging gently into the dark, rich earth. After a moment, he pulled his hand back out. Resting in his palm, covered in dirt but unmistakable, was the small, silver locket. Layla, in her confusion, often returned things to the earth. She would plant spoons, buttons, and other small treasures in the house's many potted plants, a habit from her childhood on a farm. It was a detail only someone who paid attention to the woman, not just the patient, would know. Lena had mentioned it to him once, a casual observation about finding a thimble in the fern by the window. He had listened. Ms. Eleanor stared at the locket in his hand, her composure finally cracking. A faint flush crept up her neck. She had been so sure. Khalid turned to her, his eyes not angry, but filled with a quiet disappointment. My mother is not a series of protocols, Eleanor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She is a person. Her care requires more than efficiency. It requires attention. It requires seeing her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words landed with surgical precision. He then turned to Lena, who was standing by the door, tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief and vindication. He walked over to her and gently placed the locket in her hand. Would you please clean this and return it to her? He asked. It was more than a request. It was a transfer of trust, a clear and undeniable statement. Later that evening, he found her in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. I'm sorry for what happened today, he said, standing a respectful distance away. You shouldn't be, Lena whispered, looking at her hands. I'm used to it. People like me. We're not supposed to be in places like this. Don't say people like you, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. And you're not in a place you are with my mother. You don't just work here, Lena. You belong here. The words settled over her, a warm, protective weight. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. not for what she did, but for who she was. The quiet girl with the simple song had finally found a place where her tune was understood. The weeks that followed settled into a gentle rhythm of shared silence and quiet understanding. With Miss Eleanor's authority respectfully curtailed, the mansion's atmosphere softened. Lena and Layla's days were no longer dictated by schedules, but by moods and moments. They would spend hours in the garden, Layla sometimes pointing to a flower and whispering a name from her youth. Lena learned the landscape of Layla's fading memory, the familiar paths her mind would travel, the triggers that brought her peace or distress. She learned that Layla loved the smell of rain on dry soil, the taste of honey in her tea, and the feel of soft cashmere against her skin. These were not facts in a medical chart. They were the small, sacred details of a life. Khalid was a quiet observer of this deepening bond. He would often come home to find his mother asleep in her armchair, a peaceful smile on her face, while Lena sat nearby, reading in the fading light. He saw how Lena anticipated his mother's needs before they were voiced, how she could calm a rising tide of anxiety with a simple touch or a softly hummed melody. He started joining them for tea in the afternoons, not as an employer, but as a son. He would listen as Lena recounted small moments from their day, Layla noticing a cardinal at the bird feeder, or tapping her foot to a song on the radio. Through Lena's eyes, he began to see his mother again, not as a patient succumbing to a cruel disease, but as the vibrant, gentle woman she had always been. One evening, as a cool autumn mist settled over the gardens, Lena found an old photo album. She sat with Layla, turning the thick, creamy pages. Layla was mostly silent, but when a photo of her as a young bride appeared, her eyes cleared. "He had kind eyes," she whispered, her finger tracing the black and white image of her husband. "Like yours," she looked up at Lena, her gaze direct and lucid. "You have them too." Kind eyes, the moment was fleeting. A moment later, the fog descended again, and she was lost in the present. But the words remained, a gift Lena would treasure. She was not just a caregiver. She was a keeper of memories, a witness to a love story that time was trying to erase. She was providing the one thing Khalid's immense wealth could not buy, a gentle, human bridge for his mother to walk as she journeyed further into the mists of her mind. This quiet interlude was a fragile, beautiful thing, a pocket of grace before the inevitable winter. Lena knew it couldn't last, but she cherished it, absorbing the lessons in compassion and dignity that Layla taught her every day, simply by being. She was learning that true value wasn't measured in paychecks or possessions, but in the quiet, profound act of easing another's passage through the world. The winter arrived suddenly, a bitter wind that stripped the last leaves from the trees in the garden. It seemed to bring with it a new stage in Layla's illness. The periods of lucidity grew shorter, the moments of confusion longer and deeper. Her physical strength began to wane. The house grew quieter, the air thick with a shared, unspoken grief. Khalid hired the best nurses, but Layla would tolerate no one near her but Lena. It was Lena who coaxed her to eat, Lena who held her hand when she was frightened by the shadows on the wall, and Lena who sat by her bed late into the night, humming her lullaby. One afternoon, the rain was beating against the window panes, a steady, somber drum. Layla was frail, her breathing shallow. She had been unresponsive all day. Lena sat beside her, holding her cool, dry hand. The room was dim, filled with the scent of lavender and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Suddenly, Layla's eyes opened. They were clear, clearer than Lena had ever seen them. She turned her head slightly on the pillow and looked directly at Lena. "The song," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "Don't stop singing it, I won't," Lena promised, her own voice thick with emotion. "You are a good girl," Layla murmured, a faint, sweet smile touching her lips. "He will be safe with you." Her eyes fluttered closed, and her breathing softened into a final, peaceful sigh. The ticking of the clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, each second a heavy, final punctuation mark. Lena sat there for a long time, her hand still holding Layla's, the silence in the room a profound and holy thing. She didn't cry. The grief was too deep for tears. It was a vast, quiet ocean inside her. Khalid arrived a few minutes later. He stopped in the doorway, seeing the stillness of his mother, seeing Lena sitting like a statue beside her. He walked in and stood on the other side of the bed, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have aged him in an instant. He reached out and placed his hand over his mother's, his fingers brushing against Lena's. In that moment, they were not employer and employee. They were simply two people bound by a shared love for the woman who lay between them. He looked across at Lena, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, the words heavy with everything he couldn't say. He was thanking her for the peace, for the dignity, for being there at the end when he could not. Lena finally let a single tear trace a path down her cheek. She simply nodded, unable to speak. The bond between them, forged in a crisis at a grocery store and tempered through months of quiet care, was now sealed in the sacred silence of loss. In the days that followed Layla's passing, the mansion felt like a beautiful, empty shell. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt heavy, echoing with absence. Lena packed her few belongings into a small bag, her heart aching with a grief that was deeply personal. Her time here was over. She had been hired for a purpose, and that purpose was gone. She assumed she would be given a generous severance and sent back to her old life, a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. She found Khalid in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers, his face drawn and tired. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw her bag. "You're leaving," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "My work here is done," Lena said softly, placing a white envelope on his desk. "This is my notice." I can't thank you enough for everything." He looked at the envelope, then back at her. "What will you do?" "I don't know," she admitted.
"Look for a job."
"Go back to how things were." "No," he said, the words sharp and immediate. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bare winter garden. "Things can't go back to how they were. Not for you. Not for me." He turned back to face her, his eyes intense. "My mother spent the last months of her life in peace, Lena. Not in fear. Not in confusion. You gave her that. You with no training, no degrees. You gave her a gift that all my money and all the world's best doctors could not provide. You gave her your humanity." He paused, taking a breath.
"I've been thinking about what she said."
"Her last words to you. He will be safe with you." At first, I thought she was confused, that she meant my father. But now I understand. She was talking about her legacy. About me. He walked back to his desk and pushed the stacks of paper aside, revealing an architectural drawing. It was a sketch of a modern, warm-looking building surrounded by gardens. "My mother deserved better," he said, his voice thick with passion. "They all do. The elderly, the forgotten, the people slipping away in cold, sterile rooms. They deserve dignity. They deserve compassion. They deserve someone to sit with them and hum a quiet song." He looked directly at Lena. "I am establishing a foundation in her name. The Layla Al-Jamil Foundation for Compassionate Care. It will build facilities like this one. It will train caregivers. It will fund research. But not research into drugs. Research into humanity. Into connection." He pushed a leather-bound portfolio across the desk toward her. "I'm not offering you a severance package, Lena. I'm offering you a purpose. I want you to help me build this. I want you to be a founding director." Lena stared at him, speechless. "Director? Her? The cashier from Billionaire? I don't know anything about running a foundation," she whispered, her mind reeling. "You know everything that matters," Khalid replied firmly. "You know how to see a person. The rest can be taught." He was offering her not just a job, but a chance to turn her quiet, instinctive gift into a force that could change the world. He was offering her a way to ensure the song never stopped. The ballroom was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and quiet, expensive chatter. Hundreds of people, the city's most powerful and philanthropic, mingled in a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Lena stood near the back of the room, feeling like an astronaut who had landed on the wrong planet. The simple, elegant dark blue dress Khalid's assistant had picked out for her felt like a costume. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, her knuckles white. She was a ghost here, an imposter who had slipped past security. She watched Khalid move through the crowd, effortlessly commanding, yet carrying a quiet air of solemnity. This was the inaugural gala for the Layla Al Jamil Foundation and the culmination of a year of tireless work. Tonight, he would introduce his vision to the world. And to her. She still couldn't quite believe her role in it all. The past year had been a blur of learning about budgets, about architectural plans, about hiring practices. Khalid had provided her with tutors, mentors, and an unwavering belief in her abilities. But her most important contributions had come not in the boardroom, but in the design meetings, where she insisted on details others overlooked. Windows that opened, gardens accessible to wheelchairs, rooms painted in warm, soothing colors, and spaces designed for quiet connection, not just clinical efficiency. She was the foundation's heart, its conscience. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the room. Khalid walked to the podium on stage, a single spotlight illuminating him. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the vast hall. "Thank you all for being here. We are here tonight to launch a foundation in my mother's name. But I am not going to tell you about her illness. I am going to tell you about a grocery store." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. "I am going to tell you about a young woman at a cash register. A young woman who, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, watched my mother fall. And while others stared or looked away, she did something extraordinary. She walked away from her job. She knelt on a cold, dirty floor, and she held my mother's hand. She didn't know who my mother was. She didn't know that my mother was wealthy or powerful. She only knew that she was a human being who was hurt and afraid. For this act of simple, profound compassion, Khalid's voice grew thick with emotion. She was fired. The room was utterly silent now. Every eye locked on him. That young woman taught me a lesson that night. That dignity is not something you can buy. Compassion is not a line item on a budget. And the most valuable thing in this world is one human being choosing to see another. The Layla Foundation is built on that principle. He looked toward the back of the room, his eyes finding hers. That young woman is here tonight. She is the heart of this foundation. She is its moral compass. And she is its founding director. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lena. A spotlight swung to find her. For a moment, she was frozen, the collective gaze of hundreds of people pinning her in place. Then, she saw Khalid smiling at her from the stage, a look of immense pride and trust in his eyes. She took a breath and began to walk toward the light, no longer an imposter, no longer invisible. She was not the girl from the supermarket anymore. She was Lena, and she had found her voice.